sorry, the network connection is really bad. So I'm gonna go ahead and talk today about the impact of cocoflavanols on age-dependent vascular stiffness. And basically, the question is, of course, what are flavanols? What are cocoflavanols? How do flavanols affect cardiovascular function in healthy people? And what the effects are on people at various ages, and whether that may have an effect actually on vascular aging. Now, one of the points that we all believe in, I think, is that diet can have an important impact on. But to understand how diet actually does the job, we also have to think about individual bioactive components that are absorbed and circulated as metabolites, affect cellular functions, affect vascular functions, and then ultimately lead to vascular health effects. And some of the kind of most prominent bioactives are flavanoids. And there are different subgroups which are very specific to individual food sources. One of the things I've been most interested in were flavanols that are very rich in cocoa and red wine. The daily intake in Europe is really low. It's about 13 milligrams only of numeric flavanols. And when you look at the amount you should eat every day, according to epidemiology studies, the amount everybody eats is much lower than actually. There are also other bioactive xanthines, and also even the flavanols are there as monomers and oligomers. And that is important because we know that the oligomers are actually not absorbed, only the monomers, and then basically circulate as metabolites, while the larger molecules, the oligomers, basically go to the gut, and in the gut they are broken down by the microbiome into phenolic acids. So that has relevance to understanding the mechanisms of actions, which are still not fully understood. Now, we started out looking into the effects of cocoflavanols, mainly using endothelial function and people with cardiovascular risk factors. And one of the questions we had in a European project was whether you can improve cardiovascular functions in healthy people. So we first generated some standardized test materials to really allow randomized controlled trials. And so people would get a drink, basically, kind of like a Gatorade that either contained flavanols at an amount of 64 milligrams, which is much higher than the average daily intake in Europe, or zero, basically. Now, what we see is that if you take this flavanols once per day, you have a peak at about 2 hours based on flow-mediated dilation. This effect is dose-dependent. And when you take this flavanols over a longer period of time, you will have the so-called chronic effects. Even after all the metabolites have been excreted from the body, your endothelial function will still be good, and this effect kind of maxes out after 2 weeks, and even if amounts, it will not anymore. Now, if you think about dietary guidelines, you obviously have to think about whether this has in young and old and males and females and a whole big segment of healthy population. So we asked the question whether this effect is also happening in different ages, and we ran a randomized controlled trial where young old people received either a control or about 410 milligrams of flavanols every day over 2 weeks. And the endpoints were endothelial function, cardiac function, arterial stiffness, blood pressure, and microvascular function. Now, those were the baseline characteristics of the roughly 30-year-olds and the roughly 60-year-olds people, that the cardiac output was significantly lower in the older people. Central blood pressure, as expected, significantly higher. Pulse wave velocity much higher, so 6 versus 10. Peripheral blood pressure in the older people, of course, also increased. The diameter of the conduit arteries. The wall shear stress in response to 5 minutes of ischemia was significant. Fusion reserve and lower flow mediated. You know that. So those are the results on the left side, the young people, on the right side, the elderly people. You can see that the older people had lower end FMD, had higher blood pressure, but the acutely and sustainedly increased FMD, but also decreased blood pressure. And interestingly, the central blood pressure, the diastolic central blood pressure, was decreased in both groups, while in the older people, only the systolic blood pressure was decreased. And this is kind of where I guess everybody's interest in this group kind of comes in, is when you look at aortic augmentation in the young people. Obviously, the central blood pressure, systolic blood pressure, is not carried very much by augmentation. It is carried, as indicated, by positive augmentation index in the elderly people. So we basically saw that in both groups, the pulse width velocity decreased by about half a meter per second, and actually explain the selective effect in older people, because only in older people a change in pulse width velocity would have an impact on systolic blood pressure, as augmentation was positive. So interestingly, we also observed that the fall on blood flow improved after Flavanol consumption, and the total peripheral resistance decreased. So again, our explanation for the selective effect on systolic blood pressure was that that change in pulse width velocity would only have an impact in the older people. Yes?
I think that your screen is frozen.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
We can hear you, but the screen has been showing, can dietary flavanol intervention improve vascular function? So we are still seeing that. And I think you were discussing results now.
Oh, it's...
Maybe you could turn off the camera.
So you only saw the one... Yes.
So if you switch off the camera, yes.
I have turned it off.
Yeah, we can.
Was that the slide?
Yes, now we can see the results. Yes, thank you.
Okay. Sorry about that. Yeah, so again, flow mediated dilation decreased in both groups, but only in the older people, the systolic blood pressure, both central and peripheral, decreased, while in both groups, actually, the diastolic blood pressure decreased. And our explanation was that this selective effect on systolic blood pressure was likely only evident in the older people, because the aortic systolic blood pressure is only in these people carried by the pulse width velocity. And we confirmed that in a bigger group, also with males and females at intermediate age. And so taken together, I think those can improve endothelial function and arterial stiffness in healthy people over a wide age range, while only in the older people, this will lead to a decrease in systolic blood pressure. And now there are a few discussion points and questions that are, I guess, important for the group. And the question is really, what do acute changes in arterial stiffness mean? Because of this means something different than chronic changes in arterial stiffness over years as a marker of vascular aging. Where the stiffness effects do secondary to blood pressure effects, or were independent of it. And some studies with other bioactives indicate different, maybe independent, because in some groups, for example, anthocyanins, flow mediated dilation would change, but pulse width velocity would not change. So it doesn't really look like this subtle changes in arterial stiffness are entirely secondary to endothelial function. And then certainly the question, if this would be given over a long period of time, do this acute changes in arterial stiffness translate into long-term decreases in increasing? And those are my acknowledgements. Thank you very much.